Welcome to the BTS Presents show.
Hi, I'm Candace Bradfield, broker and owner of Bradfield & Associates, and past president of our Santa Cruz County Association of Realtors. I want to thank you for joining BTS Presents. We're going to be talking about the Santa Cruz County and Silicon Valley real estate.
Good evening, my name is Dr. Justin Cummings.
Hi, I'm Viveka Jagadeesan.
My name is Krohn, Santa Cruz City Council.
And I'm Cynthia Chase, Santa Cruz City Council member.
And we are here to have a conversation about housing in Santa Cruz.
Yeah.
What about on the opening statements? Start with Cynthia and work our way down. What are we doing about housing in Santa Cruz?
Yeah, good question. So one of the things I'm here to talk about is the last 6 months of engagement with the community that produced this report, Santa Cruz Voices on Housing. And it was a really incredible opportunity and an incredible experience to actually listen to hundreds of people from the community. The goal really was to try to get to the voices that we don't typically hear at the City Council, because as we know, for a lot of different reasons, the community, it's hard to engage with City Council in sort of that formal way of coming to the meeting and sitting there sometimes for hours to have your voice heard on something. So this really was very intentional to go out to the community, to reach out to groups that haven't been at council or engaged or have been very difficult to reach, and hear from them everything and anything that was their concern around housing. And we learned a lot of things, and what I've said before and I'll continue to say is that the desperation that is felt in this community is profound, and that is among many, many community members. Of in particular importance to me, that stood out to me, was really that 20 to 40 year demographic that we have seen vanishing from our community. And that's really a lot of the workforce, that's a lot of the families that are here, young professionals, people who sometimes for multiple generations their families have lived here and they can't stay. And it's heartbreaking actually to hear from them what this housing crisis has meant in their lives and what it's meant for the trajectory of their lives. And many of them are leaving. And it's really pretty incredible to hear that. So that's mostly what I really want to come and represent today, is what I heard from folks, and then also what the city is doing about that. And we can talk a little bit about the report, which was divided into 3 sections: housing production, housing protection, and community vitality. And so I'm hoping to hear from you all about those things as well.
Cool. I'm here tonight as a person who moved here 10 years ago. I came here for grad school originally. Managed to get my Ph.D. along with the equivalent of a master's in environmental studies. And during that time, for grad students, it was very expensive given the amount of money that we were given for our stipends and TAing and what we had to live on. I then left and moved to Miami for 2 years and came back, and the situation was so much worse. And being someone who has, kind of lived this American dream of going to college, getting 2 bachelor's degrees, getting my Ph.D., to then move to a place where, making a modest income, I still have to find myself having to live with other people. Like I have to rent and share my housing. There's no prospect right now of me ever being able to afford my own home in this town. And in addition to that, so many people around me kind of getting to this point of people being displaced. I mean, not only are people having to leave, but people are being forced out of their homes. Last year alone, I had at least 10 people I knew who were giving 30, 60-day notices and had to move out of their place. And it's not because they didn't pay their rent. It's not because they destroyed their property or that they were bad members of the community. It was just the fact that their landlords wanted them to move out. A number of those places, they did renovations and they doubled the rent. And just because they had that ability to do that, they displaced people. And some of those people got really close to having to move out of town, which means they'd have to find a new job, find somewhere to put their stuff in the meantime, and come up with all those funds to account for this displacement.
Quick question, how different was Miami than here as far as the sort of competition for housing?
The competition in Miami was fairly high, but Miami is such a big city that there's so many more options that we don't have here in Santa Cruz, unfortunately. The demand here is very high and the supply is very low. And as a result, this doesn't provide tenants with any leverage when it comes to being secure and stable within their homes, since landlords can just give you a 30 to 60 day notice and ask you to move out. And so having had all of those friends become displaced, it really pushed me to want to join the movement for housing justice and work with people in the community to find some kind of solution.
Hi, I'm here as an expert on a housing crisis. I'm here as someone that really, really deeply knows what it's like to be impacted by the complete lack of leverage and bargaining power and rights that tenants have in this rental market. When I was 19, I became disabled due to living in a moldy home, and it took me 4 years to get back to a point where I could consider looking for part-time work again. You know, nobody should have to go through that. And the reason I went through that is because I was living in a moldy apartment and knowing that I had very few options in terms of asking to get my apartment fixed, potentially at the cost of having my rent increased or being evicted, and then not being able to find anywhere else to live that I could afford in the neighborhood, you know? And I was in that situation. There are so many other people in that situation or other similar situations of total desperation. And nobody should have to go through that. Nobody should have to lose years of their life. Nobody should have to live on the streets. No older person, no disabled person, no person, you know, deserves to have to suffer without access to stable, healthy, affordable housing. I believe all of us have a right to a home, and I believe that tenants have the right to a safe, affordable place to live in their community, just like everybody else, and I'm here to make a case for that. And that's why I started working on this rent control measure.
I encourage anyone to jump in, but the question I had is, I know you're the Movement for Housing Justice. How is that, how would a rent control initiative change the way it was when you were 19 and you moved into a place that had moldy conditions?
You know, I think in two ways. First of all, it would mean that there would be eviction protections, that I couldn't have been evicted for any old reason. I would have to be evicted for a just cause. So I wouldn't have had to worry about being evicted just for making a complaint, which people are constantly. Second, it would mean that, well, if I was living in a covered unit, that my rent couldn't have been arbitrarily increased for making that complaint. And the other reason is just so that there would be an increase in supply of affordable housing for me, so I wouldn't have had to feel like, oh, there's nowhere else I could go that I could even afford. So I wouldn't have had such desperation that I had to even consider staying in a place that I knew was making me ill.
And I'm here tonight, Chris Krohn from Santa Cruz City Council, wearing 4 hats actually, or 3 hats. I am a landlord. I work at UCSC and I'm on the city council. And I even rented some of my stuff Airbnb at the time, so I'm familiar with all the ways that people make it. We also rent some stuff to Section 8. Most of the apartments are Section 8. And I just have seen in my time here in Santa Cruz, 30 plus years, it go from bad to worse to, you know, maxed out housing-wise. It shouldn't be like this. We have an economic system that's, you know, pushing people. You know, I get stuff in the mail that says, you know, you should really be renting this place at X, and your house could be sold for this, and you're undervalued. Airbnb did the same thing. They said, you're only renting this for $99 a night. You know, it could be a $117, and why are you doing that? I mean, it's like accusing you of something. And I know that you have good landlords that sometimes are pushed by this market, and sometimes the market is pushed by people who really are gouging, and maybe there's a handful of those folks, and that's moving this whole thing. And I just see putting this on the ballot as a sort of like, okay, let people decide. If this is I don't see rent control as the end-all be-all. I see it as maybe a piece of this housing puzzle. There's a lot of other things that maybe need to happen in the meantime, but if people think that this is a solution and it'll help, I'm saying, let's put it on the ballot. Let democracy prevail in this case.
I appreciate the point you just made about this being a piece of the puzzle, because I think that is part of the conversation that gets missed a lot, is that people want to blame the crisis on one thing, and they want to also say that there's one thing to solve it. And this is really incredibly complex, and that's one of the things I think that, generally people want things to be simple so they can better understand them and so we can better solve them, right? And this is not one of those things. This is something that has so many facets and so many layers, and anytime we sort of flip one lever, it has a ripple effect in these other categories. So I think that would be something interesting for us to talk about, is sort of the rent control, which has come up a couple times, and the potential costs and benefits of that, because that's something that people are already talking to us about. We're getting calls about people who, I don't know if you're getting them, I'm sure you are too. We're getting calls and emails for people who were evicted or given notice before it went into effect, for people who are now taking units off the market. So anytime you start to try to do something to make some positive change, you get these other things that you didn't intend to get. And so now, there's all kinds of things that are happening that I think we're going to have to grapple with as a community and figure out, where is the sweet spot of this, so that we are creating opportunities for safe, affordable housing, and also that we are thinking about what are the unintended consequences that could come of this too.
How do you respond to those people, by the way? Like the ones who are saying, oh, I'm getting evicted.
Yeah.
Is it February 14th? Is that when it went into the effective date, supposedly?
Yeah.
Because I think this is all new territory.
It's totally new territory.
And you're talking from city council perspective.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
We consult with the city attorney, and we're trying to figure out.
Yep.
I've sent him multiple questions.
Yeah, so we have a fact sheet now, which I think has been really helpful to people, that's online. But it's complicated, and there's everybody has a very different, very specific and unique circumstance. So some of it is driven by, is it under Costa-Hawkins? Is this, meaning single family in 1995, and that, which we can talk about the details of. But and then also it's the timing, and was this before, was this after, all these other things. And then depending on how long they've lived there, and if they have other circumstances like disabilities and things like that. So there's all kinds of variations. So there's not really a simple answer to this. So I'm doing my best to help interpret based on what I understand, and using the fact sheets, and then sometimes referring folks to the city attorney in case I, don't feel like I understand it completely. But it's complicated.
Justin, you're carrying this rent control petition, right?
Yes.
Tell us, what's that been like? How are you being received, and why are you doing it?
Yeah, I've been getting a lot of positive feedback, and a lot of people are really excited about the potential. Well, first, they're excited about the freeze that's actually in place right now, and they really want to see it on the ballot. They want to see it get passed. And I think the one area where people have been a little sad is the fact that it doesn't cover single-family homes due to the Costa-Hawkins Act. But if that gets repealed and this is able to cover single-family homes, so many people, renters specifically, are very much for it.
Can you say what Costa-Hawkins is?
So Costa-Hawkins is an act that was passed back in 1995, which allows for single-family homes, condos, and any multi-unit building built after 1995 to be exempt from any sort of rent control at the state level. And so if that, there's a movement right now, in addition to the city rent control measure that we're trying to get on the ballot, there's also statewide a measure that they're trying to get on the ballot to repeal Costa-Hawkins. So, and it sounds like that campaign's going pretty well, and it's being well received across the state. So it's not just a Santa Cruz thing, and we've seen these kinds of movements pop up in the Bay, in Southern California, and so I think that there's just a very high demand for these types of regulations to be in place to protect renters in California.
Viveka, same question. You're carrying the petition. How are people receiving that?
Well, it largely is a lot of people being like, oh my God, yes. Like, why can't I sign? And then they'll be like, yes, I'm really excited to sign this. And then sometimes they discover that they live in Live Oak and are like not actually eligible to sign it. So there's a lot of disappointment from people that don't live within the Santa Cruz City Council limits. Aside from that, I would say that there's, the most common no response I get is from homeowners or landlords that are automatically like, oh, well, I'm concerned that will cut into my profit margin. Absolutely not. But there's quite a number of landlords that are working on this campaign with us, and I think the reason for that, and I think you can probably speak on that better than I can, is that this isn't something that's like anti-landlord. Our law has a provision that guarantees landlords a fair rate of return on their property. So there's nothing inherently bad about this for people who are in that business.
I'm in it a lot of times. Working at the university, I see what's going on firsthand. The university hasn't been keeping up building housing. They house the same percentage of students, but when I was a student, it was like 7,400. And now there's almost 19,000, and they're still doing 50%. And so that's displaced so many units of housing, or potential units, because I've noticed and I've talked to students, and they're willing to put 5 students in a 2-bedroom. And right now, if you go to Felix Street, at the end of the street, there's a big, huge complex. It's $750 to $800 per spot in there. So they're just paying every student. They're doubling in rooms. And when I was an undergrad, we had our own room, even living in town, and as a graduate student as well. And I see the students suffering. And I had an email today. It was really interesting. Like, why would I go to this meeting? The university's having a meeting tomorrow night to talk about the housing situation. I was just putting the word out. She says, well, I support the university. Well, I support the university too. And I support quality education for our students. And right now, it's diminished greatly because of the struggle for housing. The transportation system is overtaxed. People are getting elbowed in the eye when they get on, so they'd rather walk across campus, instead of waiting for the next shuttle. They're sitting on the floors in the classrooms and stuff. So that really moves me, because I think Santa Cruz is an amazing place, and it used to be the alternative university in the system, in the UC system, and we've just it's fraying right now, and I feel like there's a chance that we could stop the hemorrhaging if we can hold it to 19,500 and implement a few different ways of around the housing issue. One might be rent control. One is 25% affordable, is what I've been calling for since the election, in every new unit of housing. I know the state just passed some things too that I think are going to support the city and hopefully support us with some money as well, and incentives for developers to build up a little bit and get these things they call density bonuses. Anyway, I don't want to monopolize. Cynthia, I know you've been knee deep in all of this. What have you heard about this, what they're talking about, rent control? How often did that come up in the conversation that you had multiple conversations in, I don't know how many? A
lot.
Yeah, would it be 50? Would that
Something like that.
Yeah, different groups of folks around town, and maybe just share with us the main issues that came up.
Yeah, I mean, housing affordability, I think, was the primary thing that people talked about over and over and over. And then, not having the options to do some of the things like you talked about. So it's so interconnected. So lots of people are in units that they have concerns about. They were really concerned about letting their landlord know because they're worried about either being kicked out or having the rent increased or still not having that improved. I talked to multiple people in separate venues who did not have kitchen sinks and were washing dishes in the bathtub. And I heard it the first time and I was like, that's crazy and unusual. And then I heard it 2 more times from separate people. So there's conditions that folks are accepting to live in that are not acceptable. And then just at a baseline, and then you add in how much they're paying to live in those conditions, and then knowing that they're so scared about saying anything because they can get evicted and somebody else can come right behind them and fill it. So those are the kind of stories. I heard a lot from, actually heard the most from city, county staff, and teachers in Santa Cruz City Schools and County Office of Education. And again, sort of in that demographic, the young families trying to live here, trying to stay here, many of them multi-generational, that really were so tied to the city, and their families gave back, they want to give back. Teachers have heartbreaking stories. One in particular, the family was two parents, and they actually split the family apart because they couldn't find a home to live in. So now one child is living with one parent and one child is living with the other parent in separate places because that's the best they could do and get a room and a home. I mean, it's, and you know, these are, I use these examples, but I have to say they aren't that uncommon. I heard them over and over and over. And so people were really saying they've completely abandoned the idea of home ownership. Really just because, and they've talked a lot about they make just enough not to qualify for like Measure O in the city or Measure J in the county, so they can't get the affordable units, and then but they don't make enough to actually be able to save anything. And then if you add in the amount of rent that they're paying, they definitely can't save because it's more than they can really afford. It's about 70% of their income. So, and lenders won't even lend on that, right? Because that's what happened last time in the crash. So it feels impossible for so many people, just the average person who is just trying to live here and get by and, you know, loves this community for all the reasons we do. So that came up a ton. Everybody so rent control would come up a lot. And generally speaking, almost 100% of the people were like, yes, we need rent control. And then I'll add to that, most of them don't understand it. So, I mean, there is a lot of education that needs to happen around this. They don't understand Costa-Hawkins. Most people think it just, that would, you know, cover everything. So people are, like I said, desperate for affordability. They're also really in need of, and I think this is an important point that we need to talk about, is the type of housing. So the right type of housing for the right circumstance. So, you know, if you're a family, you need a single family home. You know, theoretically, certainly more than 9 students need a single family home, right? So it's about getting single people, individuals in smaller units, right, which they typically want, that works for their lifestyle. And larger homes for families who want that. And then also helping seniors downsize. Like, so really thinking about, do we have the right composition of the types of housing here with the level of affordability that we need for people to live in the right spaces? Or are we going to continue to have 8 students or 10 students in a single family home? So that kind of, I mean, that encapsulates a lot of things, but that pretty much captures what a lot of people were talking about. And then there's a lot of details about transportation and, you know, all of those kinds of things, and parking and the impacts to neighborhoods that people are concerned about. And so that's kind of another topic as well.
Yeah.
So
Go ahead.
I'm curious about something, and I often hear this as an objection to rent control, which is that, this will chill development, and right now, people aren't developing the solutions to the housing crisis in terms of building, because there are all these restrictions on development. Is that true? Is that true that there are lots of developers who want to build new housing in Santa Cruz that's affordable and are not being allowed to?
I think it's a complicated issue. So to put an affordable development together is hard. It's the one that has come before council the most is on Water Street, and that is probably 5 different sources of funding to get that project to go forward. Okay. So it's again one of those things that it's not a simple answer, right? So I think that there are definitely affordable housing developers that would love to do
so
housing.
Are we talking for-profit development? Are we talking, what kind of development are we talking?
So this is an affordable housing developer.
Okay.
That's what they do.
They'll still make a profit.
Yeah. They're still making a profit.
Yes.
Okay.
But the one she's speaking of seems like a very good development. But
so it sounds like there's one development, potentially, that there's one person. There's one person trying, or not one person, but one project that's people are trying to push forward right now. That's like an affordable housing development.
It's changed multiple times. So I think we're somewhere around 50, maybe 60. The project's changed given different housing monies that were available, and so then based on that, then the things, you know, the total units can change. But it depends. I mean, so there's more factors to it than that. Is there a space for them to develop on?
Sure.
There's all those kinds of things. They got to get lending for it. Like that, in that circumstance, there's 5 different sources of funding that had to come together, and then they have to work within our zoning code and all these other things. So I think the quick answer to your question is, are there limitations? Yeah, I think it's hard. So
I'm also curious,
difficult.
sorry to interrupt, but
That's fine.
Also about just generally, so that's the affordable end of it. So what's just generally, are there folks trying to develop things that aren't going through, and like what's the amount of that?
I'd say that's true too. So there are many things that are approved in the city, projects that once they're approved, they still have to get funding, and that's challenging. So that's another step, and that's outside the city council. We influence it, though, because some of the requirements that we have within the city then impact the type of lending. So generally speaking, the more requirements a city, or a county even, puts on projects, the more challenging the financing gets, and that's a fact. So it just depends. So it's not easy. So there's a bunch of things that are approved, they need financing. Then there's things that need to get approved, and then that would come to us, depending on the type of project, and see if we can get those things to go forward.
And there's a couple projects that we've been working on recently in the downtown area, and that usually will bring your affordable housing provider sooner than later if you provide the space, the land. So then we might turn over a piece of property to the affordable housing provider, then they go out and do what they call tax credits, which is tax increments. It's the rich people invest in these bonds, I guess, or some, and then that helps pay for the project.
So any rich people watching this, Chris.
Well, invest in housing, I guess.
Invest in housing, that
Invest
too.
in housing is a good thing.
I'm also curious, final question on the development end of things for you two. So we've heard that there's potentially one project that's trying to go through for developing affordable housing.
No, that's already passed.
That's
done.
That's
That's on Water Street next to Kiva House, and then there's a couple others in downtown.
There's a couple of potential. So there's a couple of potential projects. 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Oh wow. Okay. In that case, I'll let someone else go.
Well, I don't want to,
Yeah, I guess I was just curious about what kind of housing is being built in Santa Cruz for the most part, because it doesn't sound like that's all of the housing that's
most of the projects and Cynthia can jump in, but that I've been a part of, it's mostly been for sale units, but then there's a what I would call a loophole that happened in like 2006, where the developer can rent them for 10 years at market rate and not provide any affordable units. But then after 10 years, they're bound to sell 15% of those units. So there's a whole bunch of projects we've done, probably 200 units that I've been a part of like that. They've all been rentals, no affordability. They do have some what they call housing authority vouchers that have been attached to some of them. I don't know if you want to add anything.
I think you covered that.
I wouldn't mind hearing about the rent board and how that there's a real strong thing on the petition that talks about it's going to take away power of the city council, or it's going to be beyond the city council, beyond the city attorney, and so I'm just wondering, is that a good thing, having a rent board, an elected rent board?
I think yes. I mean, it's going to be members of the community who are going to be able to address these issues that are coming up around people being treated fairly. Whether or not their rents are going to be, going up, or if they're going to be going up above the consumer price index and the determined percentage for that year. Additionally, it's an opportunity for the landlords to come forward and say, hey, I put all these improvements in my house. I need a fair return on my investment. Is there any way I can adjust my rent? And that's what the rent board is there for, is to hear both sides of this whole control issue, and to make sure that everyone's getting treated fairly.
Is there any place to go now if you have a problem as a renter that you know of?
As of right now, the Santa Cruz Tenants Association has been helping people answer questions, and a number of people met with members of the city council last week, and I think they've been working with the planning department. They've been working with the planning department to try to figure out who's going to be in charge of answering these complaints.
Anybody has some closing comments on the housing crisis in Santa Cruz affecting all of us?
I think that by getting some measure of rent control in place and providing the security for people to stay in their homes and not constantly live in this fear of I might be displaced at any last minute is going to improve the quality of living and the sense of community that we have in this town. I mean, we've mentioned how teachers get displaced, city workers, this affects a lot of them, and we want to keep people here because from an economic perspective, if a lot of people move out of the city, so does the money that they're bringing with them. So if they're working here, but then they live in Salinas or Watsonville, they're going to spend more money in those areas. So if you keep them in the town, they're going to spend more money and stimulate the local economy. And so I think that it's important from an economic perspective and from a community perspective that we just keep as many people here as we can.
Yeah.
And we've also heard that the real estate community has said, well, people usually move over 50% of the people move every year. but this keeps people in their homes. Like in San Francisco, only 11% of the people move every year. How would you respond to that?
That's great. I want this to be a community where people can stay here long term and really invest in the community.
Thanks for watching the show.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.
Really appreciate it.